Hello, everyone. I'm Stéphane Lafortune, a faculty member in electrical and computer engineering in the College of Engineering. And today we are visiting with Professor Jennifer Haverkamp, who is the Graham Family Director of the Graham Sustainability Institute at the University of Michigan. Professor Haverkamp is also a professor from practice at the School of Law, as well as a professor of practice at the Ford School of Public Policy. She earned a law degree from Yale Law School and a master's degree in politics and philosophy from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. Professor Haverkamp is an internationally recognized expert on climate change, international trade, and global environmental policy and negotiations. She has held many leadership positions in her distinguished career, including public service in the US government, at the State Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the Justice Department. At the University of Michigan, she was co-chair of the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality. Joining me today in this discussion, we have two undergraduate students with an interest in sustainability, Lydia Fraz and Mark Bayred. Professor Haverkamp, it is a pleasure to be with you today in your beautiful office on Central Campus. And we thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. So I will start with a introductory question. So in our course this semester, we are looking at sources of emissions of greenhouse gases and learning about current and prospective technologies to mitigate these emissions. But based on your wide experience dealing with climate change at the global level, what would you tell our students in the College of Engineering about the most promising solutions ahead, as well as the greatest challenges that we are facing in their implementation?
Thank you very much for that question, and first for inviting me to speak with you and your students. That's a very big question. We could go on for days, but I'll try to hit a few high points. What I would like to start with, though, is qualifying a little bit what my global experience is. I am not an engineer, so I don't have the technical depth, I'm sure, of many of your lecturers. So look forward to talking more about the policy, the international political side of things, and what I've seen there, and happy to take any follow-up questions as we go along. So as far as promising solutions, I guess the first thing I would say is, at the highest level, we already have a lot of the necessary technologies. We know in a lot of cases what we need to be doing. So the question is, why do we not have the political will to implement them, or the price signals, or the policy levers to make things happen? It's also true that for a lot of these new technologies, even as new research is happening, there is a lot that has to happen to bring them to scale, to move them from the theoretical to the commercial viability. And that, I think, is somewhere where there needs to be a lot more help and nudging and infusion of resources along the way. So in terms of what I consider areas for optimism or feeling like things are moving in the right direction, I think that we're doing pretty well with the power sector. There is great technology out there for solar, for wind, and in some countries it's being deployed rather rapidly. China is a leader in solar and wind development. The problem with China is that they're also still building new coal-fired power plants. I would say offshore wind is an area that is getting increasing attention in the United States. They're finally starting to do some building in the East Coast. There's finally an auction for leases off the coast of California. And so Europe is ahead of us, but when you look at where the needed resources are for power generation, I think offshore wind is going to fill a lot of the gaps that we now have. Talking about, again, solar, India is deeply committed to solar. Mm-hmm. I think that hydrogen is the new frontier. When you're thinking about where you should go career-wise, I think there's a lot of research that still needs to be done to make hydrogen viable, but it's such a great feedstock and easy to produce, and when you have excess renewable energy that can be used to generate it, that's promising. a really important source of emissions across different technologies, of course, is mobility. The automobiles, trucking, shipping, aviation, all of those are a very large component of the problem. And so when you think about where the challenges are and where things need to be done, I would say all three of those areas need a lot of attention. Vehicle mobility, I think we're doing quite well. The transformation to more and more electric cars is finally happening. Again, other countries have a lead on us in terms of trying to move their fleet in that direction or even require the phasing out of internal combustion engines. But the big automobile companies in the United States are investing big in that. The University of Michigan is investing big in that.
Yes.
And we're a huge contributor to the solution with all the great work we've done on mobility, on batteries. Plenty more to do, but I think that's great. And you all are probably pretty familiar if you drive an electric car or think about buying an electric car, what the challenges are. Range, size and weight of the batteries, what is the system for, knowing where your next station to charge it is and how rapidly it can be charged.
Right.
And so those all need to be done. And then people are paying more and more attention to the environmental cost of mining for a lot of the minerals in lithium, cadmium, the things that go into making batteries.
Right.
So, I think battery research is still a really important area to address the whole sustainability of electric vehicles. Aviation is one of my favorite topics, actually, because I worked on the negotiation of an international agreement to reduce emissions from global civil aviation while I was at the State Department. But aviation is at least 2% of global annual emissions. Okay. And it might be, when you add in the impact of contrails, up to 3.5%.
Wow.
And so the other thing is that air travel is expected to continue increasing.
Sure.
Especially as large emerging economies like India and China don't have anywhere near as much internal flights as we have in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's a huge, it's a huge source of global trade, rather way of shipping goods. So I think that we really need to focus on the aviation sector. And that is a huge challenge.
Right.
Because most of their emissions are obviously from their fuel. They already have all sorts of incentives to minimize the weight of the plane.
Yes.
Because they want to lower the cost. So what are the sustainable alternative forms of propulsion? Batteries are big. Hydrogen's big, takes up a lot of space. Maybe we can move to electric for short hop flights.
Right.
The industry is putting a lot of its hope in sustainable aviation biofuels.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some research being done here at Michigan in that area. And they actually, when you look at where they're trying to go to meet their targets, they would need to massively transition to sustainable aviation biofuels to reach these targets. But right now, they're still not anywhere near commercially viable. The airlines that are including those in their mix right now are doing it at fairly significant cost for the purpose of learning how to do it. And the other thing is, in the whole area of biofuels, to transition a lot of fossil fuels to biofuels requires an amount of land that, if you're going to be using crops or waste biomass, that very quickly bumps up against the availability of land and goes into direct competition with what you would need to grow food.
I see.
Not to mention all the other uses we're trying to put land to right now, like solar and wind farms.
Exactly.
So the whole question of trade-offs in land use is a huge issue for the energy transition.
And that's not just in the U.S. It's
at all.
Everywhere.
It's
right?
global, absolutely. But just to wrap quickly on aviation, so we have a great group in aerospace engineering focused on sustainable aviation, and areas that need improvement are not only, the engines, the design of the planes, but also air traffic management, because a lot of the emissions come if you're circling the airport.
Sure.
And that's all important. The industry has set a 2050 goal for net neutrality for commercial aviation
I see.
globally.
Globally.
Yeah. So that makes me encouraged that they're moving in the right direction.
It's ambitious.
It's very ambitious in that, especially because they don't really have an answer yet besides these
Right.
biofuels. But the international agreement that I mentioned requires them to purchase offsets for any emissions above the 2019 baseline.
I see.
So we could have a whole separate conversation about offsets. But we won't right now.
Okay.
I just want to mention shipping and then let us move on a bit.
I was about to ask about shipping.
Yeah. So shipping has been lagging behind aviation. There's an international body called the International Maritime Organization, and they did make some commitments, I think in 2018 or so, toward more efficient engines and better engine standards, but only this month did they agree on a global target of 2050 for net neutrality in shipping.
I see.
And there, I think they have more options than aviation does.
Okay.
Hydrogen might be a great source of
Right.
power for that sector.
How about nuclear?
Possibly, quite possibly. And as folks, I hope, know, we have a great nuclear engineering department here as well. And so I think that there are definitely opportunities in the shipping area, but like aviation, it's a quite significant component of global emissions. And it's not the responsibility of any individual country, because those emissions fall as you're traveling between countries.
Correct.
And they're not in the Paris Climate Agreement targets of individual countries either.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
Okay.
they fall outside.
Fall outside.
Yeah, which is why the IMO and the International Aviation Organization are the ones that have to regulate or incentivize emission reductions in those. So, anyway.
How does shipping compare in size to aviation in terms of emissions?
I think it's pretty comparable.
Pretty comfortable.
Yeah.
Wow.
I don't know that there's the same potential for growth
Right.
over the next few decades as there is for aviation, because of the use of aviation also more for personal travel or recreation, tourism, as well as goods shipment and trade. I want to hit on a couple others. I don't want us to forget about the other greenhouse gases. I've been
Okay.
talking mostly about carbon dioxide now,
Right.
but methane, hydrofluorocarbons, nitrous oxide, there are 6 other greenhouse gases regulated and countries are required to include in their greenhouse gas inventories.
Okay.
Methane, I would say, is a huge problem and a huge issue. And that's for a couple reasons. One is, if you consider carbon dioxide equivalents, a ton of methane has 70 to 80% and 80 times the potency of carbon dioxide
Okay.
over the next 20 years on a 20-year time horizon. If you think about methane's effect over 100 years, it's down closer to maybe just 30 times as bad. But we're facing an immediate climate emergency where there are a lot of tipping points that we could hit in the next 10 or 20 years, which is a reason to really go after the potent short-term climate forcers, if not at the same time, ahead of some of the things we're trying to do on carbon dioxide. So with methane, I think that we need to do a lot more work on what are the technologies that will reduce fugitive emissions from the whole system of production, transmission, and use. I think regulatory practices across the world are what's needed. What are the disincentives for flaring when you have that as a byproduct of, the oil and gas production, oil production? There is so much fugitive emissions all along the system that for all the talk of natural gas, methane as a good alternative to coal,
Right.
that works only if you reduce all these fugitive emissions along the way. So that's important. That's actually a very interesting area for development and research and changes, including things like developing feed additives so that cattle burp less.
Right.
An awful lot of emissions from agriculture are a lot of methane emissions from agriculture, and they're from animals, they're from ruminants.
Enteric fermentation is fermentation in the body of cattle and cows. That
Exactly. The fact they chew their cud, so just if you're trying to think about how to reduce the greenhouse emissions in your diet, eat less beef.
So you would definitely agree with, I was just going to ask, a lot of people are like, oh, one person doesn't really make the change, but do you really truly believe that having a bigger group kind of go more towards vegetarianism and kind of take more cattle and beef out of their diet? Do you think that would really make a difference from an individual perspective and then globally as well?
I think that individual behaviors have ripple effects on other people. And so I think there is real value in looking for ways to reduce your own carbon footprint.
Okay.
As far as your diet, I would say that even people making small changes help.
Okay.
Meatless Mondays, or, switching from beef to this kangaroo. No, seriously, but
chicken.
Beef to chicken, are ways to reduce the greenhouse gas impact of what you eat.
Okay.
And actually, since you mentioned food, one of the most important things you can do food-wise is waste less food. About a third of the food produced is wasted. And in developing countries, it's wasted in the field, it spoils in transit because it's not efficient. In countries like the United States, a lot of it isn't wasted until you bring it home from the grocery store. And there are so many embedded emissions in that food by the time it gets to your refrigerator and it turns into compost in your produce bin, speaking from personal experience, that reducing food waste is a great way to reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture and food production. So it's important.
And then you mentioned global incentives a lot, kind of here and there throughout. So as somebody who's worked in policy and worked at the State Department, what's a brief way of kind of describing how that even occurs with multiple countries? I mean, I'm just an engineering student, so that seems kind of unfathomable, but how does that work?
Let me make sure I answer your question. So how do countries come together and try
how
to
do
change
you
things?
make that a global incentive to get rid of, say, and how long does that typically take, especially as we're on such a short timeline with
I'll give you I'll walk through an example for you, which is hydrofluorocarbons. HFCs are a very potent greenhouse gas. Methane may be 70 times, a lot of them are thousands times more potent than carbon dioxide. And they are used primarily as refrigerants and coolants. They also have more arcane uses like propellants in meter dose inhalers, so people who have asthma. And as the world is becoming more prosperous, as we want it to be, there's greater need for refrigeration for all this food. As the world gets warmer, there's greater need for air conditioning. So the anticipated growth in need for HFCs was very clear. And HFCs are actually a less ozone depleting alternative to chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons. And so it was actually the governments who are party to an international agreement called the Montreal Protocol which is about the phasing out of ozone depleting substances, came together and realized they had to agree to phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbons. And that was one of the negotiations I was involved in at the State Department. Why does it matter? Well, because they're so potent and because their expected growth was so great. The agreement that countries reached to phase down by at least 80% by 2035, the use of these things is expected to avoid 0.5 degree of warming this century.
Wow. That's a lot.
It's a whole lot. It's a whole lot. But how did we come together on that? It took at least a decade, from when people first were saying we ought to negotiate this amendment to where countries could come around to the table and agree to it. Very large, complex negotiations because every UN country is a member of the Montreal Protocol.
Wow.
And so it was reaching agreement across all these countries. It took things like the industry developing some acceptable, cost-effective alternatives. There's actually a research agenda in this international agreement where academic experts from around the world form panels and answer questions and identify alternatives. And so there's a very, rigorous science-based and economic base for the decisions they were making. Largely, it took China as a huge greenhouse gas emitter and leader of the developing country world to come to the table and say, we need to make this happen. So just in terms of the politics, it was the US and China very much partnering on this amendment has to happen. There are lots of reasons why the Montreal Protocol has been a successful international agreement. It also includes a significant fund that countries contribute to so that as these obligations are taken on, the developing countries have financial assistance making the transition and meeting their new obligations. And they're given more time to reach the goals and things like that. But it's a fascinating, complex process where countries generally form groups and coalitions and years and years of work and lots of bilateral diplomacy in between negotiating sessions. Success is not ever guaranteed. On that one, there are at least 2 other big international meetings where the goal of some countries was to conclude the agreement, and they didn't get there. And we actually couldn't get there until after the Paris Agreement was concluded in 2015. Because a lot of countries didn't want to give up negotiating leverage until they got what they needed to out of Paris. And then in 2016, they came together.
Do you see more agreements like that kind of coming together in the next upcoming years, specifically with carbon emissions and
Well, it's a
greenhouse
good
gas
question.
emissions?
There's some interest in whether nitrous oxide ought to be addressed somewhere the way we do these other emissions. I think there's potential for more global cooperation on what to do about methane. The big international negotiation underway right now is about plastics and plastics pollution, which is connected to greenhouse gas emissions, not quite as directly, because once plastic's produced, it doesn't really degrade. But the production of plastics can generate a lot of emissions, and if you're going to try to recycle plastics, there's usually energy inputs to that. So there's I think across a lot of these, what you need to do is reduce at the front end. Use less, burn less, generate less. Efficiency is the way to go before you start trying to deal with the waste that you've generated.
Do you mind if I ask specifically, in terms of like methane and greenhouse gases that also occur naturally, how do countries measure their progress and then relay their progress back to these panels?
So Under the UN climate agreement, countries have to have their greenhouse gas inventories and report their emissions. And your natural emissions are included in your global total. I think the satellite system for measuring those emissions has gotten better. I don't know a lot. I'm not terribly familiar with the details there, but look at these forest fires. Those are adding huge amounts of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And similarly, like methane, that's one of the feedbacks that people worry about.
Mm-hmm.
That as the permafrost warms or the frozen waters thaw, and you've got these big emissions of methane being released and making things worse. Yeah, in problematic ways. But those are supposed to be included in countries' emissions, and similarly, to have some sense of what your forest cover is, and as you lose it, things like that. That's the other thing that we have to do is avoid losing the Amazon and the Congo Basin forests. Huge amount of carbon is stored in them.
Yeah, it reminds me of what you were talking about earlier. It's like there are so many ways we can use our land, but at the same time, our land is a really natural carbon sink that we have to preserve. So it strikes me as in order to produce the biofuel, we might have to drain some peatlands, and then the peatlands can't store the CO2. So, do you think it's possible that we have enough land on Earth to really fix the problem?
I don't think we have enough arable land to look to it as a major source of biofuel. And especially because I think we not only need to keep the forest cover we have, but try to increase global forest cover. So I think we need to find more efficient ways to use the land that we now have.
In terms of land, I know a lot of like lithium mining, and then for solar panels and kind of all that new era of technology focused on green energy, a lot of the lithium from readings that I've seen and other lecturers is in a lot of protected lands and a lot of different Native American reserves. And so especially as like the policy behind that, what are your thoughts kind of on like the global climate justice perspective of then mining these like lithium mines and gathering those different minerals when they're in maybe more protected sites?
Well, I think climate justice is a really important cross-cutting question, and it takes lots of forms. In the specific one that you're talking about, I think what matters is that lands that are the homeland of indigenous peoples, they have to be fully involved in and participants in the decision making about that. Sometimes, you see Native American or other indigenous lands where, some of our biggest solar arrays are on Navajo or other tribal lands. Some of our biggest fossil fuel power plants are on tribal lands in this country, because they're looking for economic development for their people. It's another reason why nuclear waste sites are sometimes on tribal lands. It's really an unjust situation that there are not economic alternatives that force these choices. But I think the other kind of huge overarching climate justice problem is that people in the countries that are most vulnerable and poor and most affected by the adverse effects of climate change are generally not the big emitters.
Right.
So,
and they don't have the resources to kind of combat it or the technology to put it into their society and try to reduce them.
Exactly. So how to help those countries leapfrog over all the carbon intensive technologies that led us to our economic development.
It's I guess it's such a challenge to think about how they can develop without and yet limit what ways they can improve their technology, where they get their energy and stuff. It's like it's not feasible, right, to do that 100%. There's limit them from using fossil fuels when that's how we got where we did.
Right. On the other hand, there are also all the human health adverse effects of burning fossil fuels.
It's true.
Yeah.
Right? And so how to make solar and wind more affordable and, accessible to those countries. It's an issue. Because the only other thing I'd say about sort of technologies is carbon capture.
Right. I was
Right.
going to ask your thoughts about that.
Which is none of the scenarios for reaching net neutrality by 2050 can be met without carbon capture. And we have a group here at the University of Michigan, the Global CO2 Initiative, which is working on, finding ways to commercialize carbon capture and use. But I think that's another great area for research and technology development, because right now the systems that are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere are hugely expensive. And the amount of carbon dioxide you would need to carbonate all the carbonated drinks people drink is a drop in the ocean for how much needs to be taken out. But, there's already a lot of know-how in the mining sector for, taking carbon dioxide and storing it underground. They re-inject a lot of it right now to make their wells more productive.
Yes.
But
So
you don't want it coming out.
Does the Paris Agreement specifically talk about carbon capture then, or it's left to individual countries?
It's more left to individual countries and companies. There is, there's, whenever you would go to one of these conferences, you would certainly hear people talking about it. But there is not, to my knowledge, affirmative obligations with respect to moving in that direction. One of the things that's quite interesting is some of these new cements, where they're finding ways to capture the carbon to incorporate into the cement production.
Right.
And cement is actually also a huge source of global greenhouse gases because it's very carbon intensive in its production, and so much of the world are still building their roads and their bridges and their dams and their apartment buildings.
There's been a lot of research in trying to create cement that requires less heat and also releases less CO2 in the creation of the gravel right before it becomes cement that you crush up to make the powder.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to see how far they're going to go with that, hopefully.
Yeah. Another initiative or another development here, Victor Lee. Are you familiar with Victor Lee's research?
Yes.
He does something called bendable cement, which is more pliable, and so it doesn't crumble and disintegrate as quickly, which also means, you need less cement over the lifetime of a road or a bridge.
So I had one question for you kind of on students and what they can do here at U of M, as you're, very involved with the Graham Sustainability Institute and you work on the President's Carbon Neutrality. So for students, specifically engineering students, what are ways that you would say they can get involved at school and then in their lives? And then additionally, as most engineering students already have pretty full schedules, instead of maybe adding a minor or trying to pursue a fellowship or something, what are still impactful ways they can incorporate these practices with their lives?
It's a great question. So a little bit about the Graham Institute first. We've been around since 2006, and were intentionally, when we were created, put in the office of the provost to show that our mission is to work with all the schools and colleges. And we're what you would call a bridge spanning organization, a boundary spanning bridge building organization. Our goal is to bring together folks across the different disciplines to help solve the big problems in sustainability, usually with external partners. So we're the bridge between university and the external organizations, and also we help bring people together across different schools and colleges. And we do that at the faculty and the student level. And as far as students, a couple things. This would be something of a time commitment, but we run something called the Graham Scholars Program. You sound familiar,
Yes.
but for those who aren't, the Graham Scholars Program is a sustainability leadership program where about 25 students per year come on board in the fall of their junior year for a 1.5 year experience. It's a cohort of students brought together from all the different schools and colleges. So it's your chance to work with students outside your discipline. And in addition to leadership training, we also then pair groups of 5 or 6 of you with an external partner organization to do a project. And so you're doing what the companies outside tell us they need, which is people to develop experience working in teams with people outside your own discipline. And the application process is in this winter term in the spring for that. But we love having engineering students in that program. Then other ways you can get involved, if you haven't heard of the Planet Blue Ambassadors program, this is open to faculty
Yes.
and students and staff. And it's a fairly brief training that you get in learning ways to bring more sustainability into your workplace and your personal life. And then it has an array of projects and activities and information that's shared with people who become ambassadors. And so encourage that. We also have lots of interns. If you're looking for paid internships, we often have 50 or 60 interns at a time in different parts of Graham that you should look out for. We work closely with the Student Sustainability Coalition and Student Life. The University of Michigan has over 100 sustainability-related student organizations.
Wow.
And you can go to the Planet Blue website for the list. If you don't see one you want to join, create one. You know?
Yeah. Do you do much, you mentioned the Student Sustainability Coalition, do you do much work with the Student Carbon Neutrality Network?
I've been here only 5 years, but
Okay.
they're already the second or third iteration of a student group focused on climate change.
Yeah.
And we do.
Yeah.
We do. And I think they're a great way for students to get engaged as well. Lots of different schools have, I think they're probably even in engineering
They
specific
span
groups.
over, I think, it's 25 to 50 clubs, I would say, that have heads and leaders in that group that come together every 2 weeks or so discussing
That's great.
their goals.
That's great. You asked about things in your personal life.
Yes.
We already talked about not wasting food and thinking about what you eat.
Yes.
What I think is probably one of the most important and most effective things you can do is vote. And vote for people because of where they are on climate change and make clear that it matters to you. Because that is the biggest way you can affect policy change at the federal, the state, and the local level is to have leaders there who are trying to do something about the problem.
Yeah.
And the United States is quite an outlier in having this be such a divisive topic politically. In most places, it's bipartisan. So we have a election already, not much more than a year from now, which is hard to believe. Presidential election. So get out there and organize people and make sure that the election goes in a way that ensures that we continue active national and international engagement on climate change.
It's great that you mentioned voting because it's so hard to really try to incorporate a lot of things into your life because you're so busy. And I mean, outlier of last year's election here on campus, I think voting typically doesn't take that much time. So
Hopefully you aren't standing in line for a long time.
yeah. Last year, but
And
so that's really great you mentioned that and
Good.
definitely impactful.
And I do think, like I said, personal action has ripple effects, especially if you talk about it with folks, right? And just get the word out.
That's super cool. I'm definitely going to check a few of those organizations out.
Good.
Yeah, there's a whole list, and you can sort if you want to like look into specific. And then speaking of the different categories, so you say you do a lot of work with the Graham Sustainability Scholars,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if you're as familiar with the ERB program.
The
because
Herb
that's-
Leadership Program?
Yeah, because
Mhm.
that's in business.
Mhm.
Would you recommend that to students, maybe especially those in IOE or students that are more interested in the business side and the difference between
My
that
understanding,
and
unless
Graham?
it's changed, is that the ERB program is only open for students in PITE and the
Yes,
business school.
It is.
And if you're in one of those two schools and
Mhm.
you're interested in the intersection between business and sustainability, I think it's a great program.
Okay.
I think, the Graham program, it will have people from PITE and engineering and Ford and business and maybe dentistry and,
Okay.
who knows
Yeah.
what. So
So would you say Graham is
LS&A.
kind of more broad then, or
it's more intentionally interdisciplinary. But, the good news about the University of Michigan is that there's so many good choices.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the course.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion.
Yes,
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
Thank you for being here. It was great talking to you.